In the spring of 2006, in a laboratory at the University of Dresden, a metallurgist named Marianne Reibold dissolved a sliver of a 17th-century sword in hydrochloric acid. She placed what remained under a high-resolution electron microscope, leaned in, and went silent. On the screen in front of her were carbon nanotubes, tiny, lattice-perfect cylinders of carbon, the same structures modern science had only learned to fabricate intentionally in the 1990s, embedded inside a blade forged 400 years before the word nanotechnology was ever spoken aloud. The blacksmith who made that sword could not read. He owned no books on chemistry. He had no microscope, no thermometer, no concept of an atom. And yet he had been doing nanotechnology with a hammer and a fire. This is not the only object that does this to scientists. There are at least 9 medieval tools that modern engineers have tried to rebuild, with CNC mills, computer modeling, electron microscopes, and budgets the original makers couldn't have imagined, and either failed completely or only matched part of what the original could do. Each one of them quietly suggests that the period we still casually call the Dark Ages was not dark, and that somewhere between then and now, in the slow erosion of guild secrets and depleted minds and master craftsmen who died before they trained successors, we lost things, real things, useful things, things we cannot get back. The strangest one on this list, by the way, isn't a weapon. It isn't a building. It's something small enough to fit in your pocket, and we'll get to it. The sword Reibold examined belonged to a family of blades the Crusaders had been terrified of for 200 years. Damascus steel, forged from small cakes of Indian iron called woots, used roughly from 1100 to 1750 AD. These blades carried a watery, rippling pattern across their surface, and a reputation that bordered on supernatural. Period accounts describe them slicing through other swords without dulling, holding an edge through battle after battle, and bending almost double without breaking. The Dresden team's discovery explained why. Inside the steel, those carbon nanotubes were encapsulating cementite nanowires, structures that gave the metal both hardness and flexibility, 2 properties that normally cancel each other out. The Woots ingots contained trace impurities of vanadium, chromium, manganese, cobalt, and nickel, drawn from specific Indian ore deposits. During the thermal cycling, the repeated heating and cooling that medieval smiths called the secret of the work, those impurities separated into planes and acted as catalysts for the nanotube formation. By the mid-1700s, the Indian mines were depleted. The exact thermal sequence was passed orally from master to apprentice, and somewhere in that chain, a generation didn't pass it on. Modern labs have come close. They have not produced an authentic match. 2 centuries earlier and 2,000 kilometers north, the Vikings were carrying something almost as impossible. Roughly 170 swords have been recovered from Norse graves across northern Europe, each one inscribed with the same 6 letters between 2 crosses, plus VLFBERH plus T. The archaeometallurgist Alan Williams subjected them to spectrographic analysis and found something that should not have been physically possible. The carbon content was close to 1%. The slag content was almost 0. To reach that level of purity, iron ore has to be heated to roughly 1,600 degrees Celsius, about 3,000 Fahrenheit. Viking Age furnaces in Scandinavia topped out at around 1,100 Celsius. The math doesn't work. The current theory is that the ingots were imported as crucible steel down the Volga River from Persia or Central Asia, where furnace technology was 800 years ahead of Europe's. When the Volga trade route collapsed around the year 1000 AD, the supply dried up. The blacksmith Richard Furrer recreated one for Nova in 2012. He told the cameras it took 11 hours of unbroken hammering on a single ingot. Then he admitted something quieter. He could replicate the blade. He could not replicate the supply chain. The Ulfberht maker had access to a global network of metallurgical knowledge that no Viking is supposed to have had. We still don't know who he was. We don't even know if Ulfberht was a name, a brand, or both. 2 blades, 2 lost recipes. 1 pattern emerging. That knowledge in this era often lived inside a single skull and died with it. But these are small objects. Wait until you see what they did with stone and gravity. In the summer of 1304, the army of Edward I sat outside Stirling Castle in Scotland. The garrison inside offered to surrender. Edward refused. He had ordered his engineers to build something he had never used in combat before, and he wanted to see it work. They called it Warwolf. By the time it was assembled, it stood over 60 feet tall, with a counterweight estimated at around 1.5 tons and a throwing arm calibrated to launch stones of roughly 300 pounds. When the garrison saw it, they tried to surrender again. Edward made them wait inside while he fired it. The counterweight trebuchet was the heavy artillery of the medieval age, and the engineering historian Donald Hill noted something strange about it. By the physics of the period, it shouldn't have worked at all. The hinged counterweight had to release at precisely the right angle. The sling had to detach at approximately 45 degrees from vertical to maximize range. The beam had to be stiff enough not to flex, but light enough to accelerate. All of this had to be tuned without calculus, without simulation software, without anything but trial, error, and the iron memory of a master engineer who probably couldn't write his own name. Modern engineering students build them every year as graduation projects. The university replicas typically reach 100 to 120 meters. Period accounts describe medieval machines throwing stones to 275 meters. The blueprints don't survive. We have the effects. We don't have the recipe. A trebuchet throws things down. Cathedral builders had the opposite problem. They needed to lift 4-ton stones up, sometimes 150 meters into the air. Their answer was a wooden wheel 4 to 5 meters wide that men walked inside like hamsters in a cage. The treadwheel crane gave a single laborer a mechanical advantage of 14 to 1. One man weighing 50 kilos could lift 3.5 tons, and 2 men could lift 7. The crane atop Cologne Cathedral was erected in 1400, stood 25 meters tall, and remained in continuous operation for 442 years before anyone took it down. The medieval builders raised the crane inside the cathedral itself, dismantled it as each floor completed, and reassembled it higher up. So the machine grew with the building. Modern carpenters who study these systems can describe how they functioned. What they admit they no longer have is the joinery skill set to build one at full scale by hand. The trees of that size are gone. The masters who could shape them without bandsaws are gone. We can model physics. We cannot build the thing. Stone and timber forgive mistakes. Now imagine the patient is a 16-year-old prince with an arrow buried 6 inches into his skull. July 21st, 1403, the Battle of Shrewsbury. Prince Henry, the future Henry V, future victor of Agincourt, future hero of Shakespeare, takes an arrow to the left side of his face, just below the eye. The shaft snaps off in the wound. The bodkin head stays lodged in the bone at the back of his skull. For days, surgeons at Kenilworth Castle try potions, prayers, herbal poultices. Nothing works. The wound is festering. The prince is dying. Then a London surgeon and metalworker named John Bradmore arrives. Bradmore looks at the wound and designs an instrument no one has ever seen before. It's a pair of slender, hollow tongs with a screw thread running through the center. Tighten the screw, and the tongs expand outward. The plan is to insert the tongs deep into the wound channel, slide them into the open socket of the arrowhead, expand them to grip the arrow from the inside, and then draw the entire mass slowly out. But the wound channel has half closed. Bradmore can't reach the arrow yet. So he takes strips of linen, soaks them in honey and rose water, and over a series of days inserts probes of slowly increasing diameter to widen the channel without tearing it. When the path is wide enough, he inserts the extractor, locates the socket by feel, turns the screw until the tongs grip, and pulls. The arrow comes out. He irrigates with white wine, packs the wound with honey and barley flour, and 20 days later, the prince walks out of Kenilworth healed. Bradmore wrote the procedure down in his treatise Philomena, describing the materials, the mechanism, and the sequence. But he never included scaled drawings or precise measurements. The historic blacksmith Hector Cole has forged a modern reconstruction that works. So has at least one other smith. The reconstructions don't match. Multiple plausible designs satisfy Bradmore's description, and the exact form of the instrument he used on a living human skull base, the one that actually saved the future King of England, cannot be identified with certainty. The Agincourt that ended the 100 Years' War depended on a tool we no longer know how to draw. Bradmore's extractor fit in one hand. So does the next one. And it contains the entire visible universe. The astrolabe is a disc of brass between 8 and 46 centimeters across, engraved with a stereographic projection of the celestial sphere. With it, a medieval scholar could tell time by the sun or the stars, determine latitude, predict the position of any planet or star on any date past or future, find the direction of Mecca, calculate the canonical hours for prayer, and measure the height of a distant tower without leaving the city wall. Travelers carried multiple plates because the geometry of the projection changed with latitude. Chaucer wrote a treatise on its use for his 10-year-old son. The Islamic world built astrolabes of such intricacy that a single instrument could contain over 1,000 engraved coordinate lines, each one cut by hand without magnification. Modern craftsmen who attempt to engrave one find that the rete, the rotating star map, demands tolerances closer to watchmaking than to metalwork. A skilled instrument maker today, using modern equipment, can spend a year producing a single working astrolabe that a medieval craftsman in Damascus or Toledo produced in months by candlelight, by eye, by hand. We can copy the shapes. The unhurried precision of the originals belongs to a kind of attention we no longer cultivate, small enough to slip into a leather pouch. But what about a tool you can't carry, can't hide, and can't even understand? In a north aisle of Salisbury Cathedral in southern England, behind a low railing, an iron mechanism the size of a small wardrobe has been ticking for approximately 640 years. It was built around 1386 by three horologists from Delft, Johannes and Willimus Friemand and Johannes Jethoit. It has no face. It has no hands. It was designed for one purpose: to drop a hammer onto a bell at the top of each hour. Inside it, a verge and foliot escapement controls the descent of two falling weights, which have to be wound up once a day. The clock was abandoned in 1884 when a newer model replaced it. Sat forgotten in a cathedral tower for 44 years. Was rediscovered in 1928 and was restored to working condition in 1956. It still keeps time. The mechanism is so simple it shouldn't survive corrosion, fatigue, or the slow drift of metal under tension. Modern clockmakers studying it cannot fully account for why this specific hand-wrought iron, this specific forging technique, and these specific tolerances have outlasted equivalents that seize within decades. We can model it. We can't reliably reproduce its longevity. 640 years of continuous timekeeping. That's almost legible. The next object is the opposite, a tool that has resisted every attempt at reading for over a century. In 1912, an antiquarian book dealer named Ulfberht Viking bought a 240-page codex from a Jesuit college in Italy. He couldn't read it. Nobody can. The vellum has been carbon dated to the early 15th century. The script, flowing, alphabetic-looking, written by at least 5 different scribes, corresponds to no known language. The illustrations include plants that botanists cannot identify, astrological diagrams in unfamiliar configurations, and naked women bathing in green pools connected by pipes that resemble plumbing. Cryptographers who broke German military codes during the Second World War tried to break this in their spare time. None of them did. A 2025 study published in Cryptologia by the science journalist Michael Greshko demonstrated that a hand-executable medieval substitution cipher could produce text with the same unusual statistical fingerprint as the Voynich script. That isn't a translation, that's a frame around the question. The tool here isn't the book itself. It's whatever method, physical or intellectual, produced 200 pages of text with the structure of a real language and the resistance of pure noise. Whoever built that tool either took it to the grave or built it precisely so that no one ever would. Some tools were lost by accident. The next one was lost on purpose. On a summer morning in 678 AD, an Arab fleet approached Constantinople, expecting to reduce the city to ash. Instead, the Byzantine ships emerging from the harbour began spraying something at them that no one in the Arab navy had seen before. It was a liquid. It clung to wooden hulls and human skin. It burned hotter as you tried to wash it off, because seawater accelerated the reaction. The bronze siphons mounted on the Byzantine warships could project it across 30 meters of open water. Soldiers covered themselves in soaked hides and prayed. Most of them died screaming. Greek fire was deployed continuously by Byzantine forces for the next 700 years. It is the reason Constantinople did not fall in 678, in 717, or in any of the half-dozen sieges that followed before 1453. And when Constantinople finally did fall, it was because the formula had already been lost. The Syrian engineer Kallinikos, credited with the invention around 672 AD, kept the production process within his family. The emperors of Byzantium passed it personally to their heirs. The 13th century princess Anna Komnene left a partial description in the Alexiad, mentioning pine resin and sulfur fired through tubes by violent breath. Modern reconstructions agree on the likely components: naphtha, quicklime, sulfur, pine resin, possibly potassium nitrate, but no recreation has matched the original behavior. The historian Arthur Rowland argued that the very secrecy that made Greek fire a military advantage is what killed it. Too few people knew all the pieces. When the system fragmented, the system disappeared. There's one more, and of all 9, it's the one that quietly disturbs glassmakers the most, because they understand the chemistry, and they still can't do it. The stained glass windows of Chartres Cathedral in France were installed between 1190 and 1220 AD. Roughly 152 of the original 186 windows survive. The most complete set of medieval stained glass anywhere in the world. They cover around 2,600 square meters of wall. Their most famous feature is a specific shade of deep cobalt blue, so saturated that, under overcast French skies, the windows appear to generate their own light. Modern chemists know exactly what it is: cobalt oxide and aluminum oxide in suspension inside the glass matrix. They can reproduce the chemistry. They cannot reproduce the effect. The reason is buried in the imperfection of medieval glassmaking itself. 12th century glass was thicker, less uniform and full of bubbles, mineral inclusions, and small variations in density that scatter incoming light unpredictably. That scattering, combined with the depth of pigment in the thicker pore, is what makes Chartres blue glow. Modern industrial glass is too pure, too flat, too even. We perfected the material. We engineered out the magic. A French conservation team has been restoring the Chartres windows since 1972. They stopped trying to match the originals years ago. They preserve what's there because making more of it is no longer possible. 9 tools, 9 kinds of knowledge that survived the collapse of the Western Roman Empire, survived the plagues, survived the wars, and then quietly died in workshops between roughly 1500 and 1800, because the apprentices stopped showing up, or the trade routes closed, or the masters guarded the formula too well. Right now, the Salisbury clock is still striking the hour above a stone aisle in Wiltshire. The Cologne crane stood in place for 442 years before someone decided it was no longer needed. The Voynich manuscript sits in a climate-controlled vault at Yale University, scanned, digitized, posted publicly online, still unreadable. Bradmore's extractor exists in several reconstructed forms, none of which we can prove is the real one. The Ulfberht swords rest in museum cases across Scandinavia, and the cobalt windows of Chartres are still glowing on overcast afternoons. In a way our factories cannot replicate, because the men who made them didn't know enough to make them properly. And that turned out to be the secret. We built the smartphone. We lost the sword. We split the atom. We cannot match the blue of a window made by craftsmen who couldn't read. The question isn't what they knew. The question is, how much else did they know that nobody bothered to write down before the last apprentice closed the workshop door for the last time?